Good evening and welcome everybody to lecture. Begin with a few moments to tell you about how the lecture came about. So during the mid-1980s, two brothers approached Miami's development office to discuss a suitable tribute to their parents, whose sacrifices made it possible for their sons to attend Miami during the years of Depression. These brothers were the Reverend Edward Puff Jr., a prominent Dayton clergyman, and Professor Harold Puff, who for many years taught at Miami's Department of Management. The result of these conversations was the Edward A. Puff Sr. and Edith Kottmyer Puff Memorial Lecture on the Study of Christianity, which has enabled the Department of Comparative Religion at Miami University to host a long series of eminent scholars as speakers. Before introducing this year's Puff Lecture, I'd like to pause to acknowledge that there are members of the Puff family here with us today. Prue and Steve, with Steve Dana, are here, and I'm not sure if others are as well, but if you are, shout out to you, who have helped to make this occasion possible. And so please give them a round of applause for continuing to support this effort. So I'd like to introduce our speaker this evening. John Swinton is Professor of Practical Theology and Pastoral Care and Chair in Divinity and Religious Studies at the University of Aberdeen. For more than a decade, he has worked as a registered mental health nurse. He also worked for a number of years as a hospital and community mental health chaplain alongside of people with severe mental health challenges who are moving from the hospital into the community. In 2004, he founded the University of Aberdeen's Center for Spirituality, Health, and Disability. He has published widely within the area of mental health, dementia, disability theology, spirituality, and healthcare, qualitative research, and pastoral care. He is the author of a number of monographs, including Becoming Friends of Time, Disability, Timefulness, and Gentle Discipleship, which came out from Baylor in 2017. His book, Finding Jesus in the Storm, The Spiritual Lives of People with Mental Health Challenges, Eerdmans in 2020, won the 2022 Aldersgate Book Prize, and his book, Dementia, Living in the Memories of God, from 2012, was awarded the Archbishop of Canterbury's Ramsay Prize for Theological Excellence. John is married with 5 children, and he's also a musician and songwriter, which we can tell from what is behind him. So we're really excited to have you with us, John, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a very kind introduction, Scott. First of all, I'm very glad to be here. I'm very glad to be able to spend some time talking to you about things that I hope will be helpful in a variety of different ways. As Scott says, my background's in mental health nursing and chaplaincy. And so I've always had kind of lots of interest in theological, practical questions about the experiences I had. I spent many years working alongside people living with schizophrenia, and that in itself raises some really fascinating questions about autonomy, about the nature of what it means to be a human being in the midst of confusion and various other things. But tonight I want to focus in on one aspect of psychosis, one aspect of schizophrenia in particular that is kind of, in a sense, iconic in relation to the way in which people think oftentimes about mental health challenges. Iconic in the sense that when you think about the idea of mental illness, very often something like hearing voices comes to mind. And you get the sense that someone who hears voices is so radically different from us that we have to push them to somewhere else. And so that process of othering goes on when we think about hearing voices, because we can never hear voices. So somebody who's really mad hears voices. Now, I want to challenge that. And I want to suggest that actually people who hear voices, there's much to be learned from that experience. So the first thing to notice is that I'm using the term hearing voices rather than the term hallucinations. Now, the reason for that is that hallucinations is a technical psychiatric term, which is absolutely fine, which frames the voice hearing as a symptom of an underlying pathology. Hearing voices capture something of the experience that people go through in relation to voices, right? So one is an explanation of a symptom, one is an explanation of the experience, what it feels like in that sense. Okay, so if I could have my slides up here, that'd be good. Thank you. The approach that I want us to be thinking about today is what's described as a phenomenological approach. I'm sorry, this slide is slightly off. The phenomenology is a philosophical perspective that teaches us how to look at the world. So a phenomenological perspective says, in order to see something for what it is, you need to put to one side your biases, your prejudices, the things that you think about that thing, and try to look at it in itself. So in the context that we're today, we're going to put to one side what we think about schizophrenia, put to one side what we think about hearing voices, and actually try to listen to the experience. And when we listen to the experience, then we begin to see something different. And it's that something different I want us to push into this evening. So the phenomenon of hearing voices occurs when a person hears a voice, either internally or externally, that's not heard by others around them. It's associated with people with psychotic disorder. However, interestingly, a significant number of healthy individuals also report hearing voices. This might surprise you, but it's estimated that between 5 and 28%, depending on what study you look at, of any general population hears voices that other people do not. In other words, there are more people that hear voices in the non-psychiatric population than there are in people who have a particular diagnosis. So hearing voices is actually a very common thing. It's very common within religious traditions. You know, Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad all heard voices. Likewise, Winston Churchill heard voices. Gandhi heard voices. A lot of very interesting and important figures heard voices. So voice hearing in itself is not as unusual as we think it is. A good example is Martin Luther King. So Martin Luther King at one stage was just about to give up on his work for equality and justice. He'd just received a terrible phone call that threatened himself and threatened his family. And he had planned to go the next day to say that I'm not going to do this anymore. I've had enough of this. And then he heard a voice. It says, it seemed as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, justice, stand up for truth. And lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world. And that was a turning point in Martin Luther King's life experience. And he continued, and we all know what the outcome of that was in terms of radical social change. So voice hearing is not particularly unusual. That's the key I want you to keep in mind. Now, there's a very interesting book by an anthropologist called Tanya Luhrmann. And the book is called When God Talks Back. And she's an anthropologist and decided to do an ethnography on the vineyard Christian communities in the United States. The vineyards are charismatic Pentecostal communities where the gifts of the Spirit are very often talked about. One of the key things that happens in the vineyard community and a lot of communities like that is that people hear the voice of God. And so that idea of hearing the voice of God within these Christian communities was normal. And she wanted to investigate why this is. What does it mean for Christians to say they hear the voice of God? And so she engaged in this wonderful piece of qualitative research. And you should read this book. It's fascinating. It's a big book, but it's fascinating. And to cut a big book short, she comes to the conclusion that Christians develop a different theory of mind from the normal theory of mind in Western culture. So your normal theory of mind in Western culture assumes that your mind is inside your cranium, that thoughts are contained within there, and there's no possibility of a thought coming from outside. That would be absolutely ridiculous. Your theory of mind says your thoughts are inside. But Christians develop a different way of perspective. Through their spiritual practices, through their, particularly the Ignatian spiritual practices, through prayer and biblical Bible studies, they learn to discern what it means, what words come from themselves, their own thoughts, and what words come directly to God. So by absorbing themselves in this tradition, they develop a different theory of mind and begin to discern different ways of thinking about thoughts in that way. Now, Luhrmann, it's quite fascinating, really, because that countercultural way of thinking is something that is you see in a lot of religious traditions, and we don't think about it. So she ties that down quite nicely. But then she goes on to do a second study, which is a very interesting study, looking at schizophrenia, psychosis, across 3 different cultures: American culture, Indian culture, Chennai in India, and Accra, African culture. And she notices something really fascinating. She says the US patients almost all self-identified as schizophrenic and used the diagnosis to talk about their condition. They knew the textbook definitions of the condition and ideas about hereditary illness. The patients know that hearing voices is a sign that you're crazy, so they often try to conceal their experiences. They dislike hearing voices and try to deny their existence. For Westerners, hearing voices is clearly indicative of insanity and therefore carries the cultural weight of such an understanding. Now think about it. Within Western culture, schizophrenia is a highly stigmatized culture, a stigmatized experience. It's one that has multiple negative connotations. So when you get that diagnosis, you also take on board these negative connotations that come from society, because you're part of society. And everybody knows, in inverted commas, that hearing voices is a sign that you're crazy. So therefore, people within the American context process their experience of schizophrenia in a quite particular way, in a profoundly negative way. So in America, voices themselves are generally unknown. So it's the voice of strangers suddenly come into your head. So that's not normal. All of the subjects heard horrible voices telling them that they were worthless and should die. Sometimes voices told them to torture others or go to war, or that the sufferer should commit suicide or was destined for a horrible end. One patient referred to her suicide voice. But when she went to India and began to speak to people there, it was a very different experience. Patients heard an audible voice, but the voice was very often friendly, and sometimes it would tease them. And the voice was familiar to them. So the patients heard an audible God who actually advised them to ignore the other evil voices. Voices didn't necessarily mean that you were crazy. Instead, the local explanation of the condition often referred to subjects being under spiritual attack by either spirits or witches. To be the victim of a witch carried less stigma than to have a mental illness. And people generally didn't talk about schizophrenia, so they didn't use that label. They had different ways of explaining it. Some of the voices were familiar people, family, kin, employers, and half the patients reported that they heard primarily or only positive voices telling them to do good and offering advice. Even when individuals in Accra heard aggressive or critical voices, they also reported hearing good voices that told them to ignore these negative influences. So you can see there's a difference here. In the American context, highly stigmatized, you only have one option. When you get the diagnosis of schizophrenia, the only option you really have is you take your medication and you continue to be ill unless you do take that medication for the rest of your life. So your life is narrowed. In the Indian and the African context, there are other possibilities, other explanations, other ways of being, which didn't exclude them from community and didn't exclude them from the kinds of relationships that were fruitful for all human beings. So patients who were diagnosed with schizophrenia tended to hear annoying relatives who told them to get dressed and cleaned up. Kin form the lion's share of voices, sometimes criticizing them, sometimes advising them, and keeping them company, consoling or helping to motivate patients. Some of these voices were reassuring, even playful. Luhrmann says that the playful voices can even become imaginary companions. So it's a completely different relationship that people have with their voices. Indian families also don't treat people with schizophrenia as if they had a soul-destroying illness. So again, it's not stigmatized. Life possibilities are not necessarily narrowed to one medical way of moving. Likewise, in Accra, positive voices are central to the experience. In the US, positive voices are treated as simply another symptom, as an aside, peripheral to the primary condition. In Accra, people even said that their voices had kept them alive. Now, how are we to make sense of this? It's really very, very interesting. What Luhrmann concludes is this. Within the African and Indian context, people are encouraged to have different types of opportunities when they start hearing voices. In America, you have one, well, at least within the sample she looked at, you're given one opportunity, you're always going to be ill, take your medication, that's the trajectory. In these other countries, there are other possibilities. People weren't taken out of their community, for example, and put in the hospital. They were actually very oftentimes kept within their family. Secondly, there's a different theory of mind at work. We saw within Luhrmann's work on Christian communities a different theory of mind, and the same thing is here. So for the American people who heard voices, the theory of mind that guided them was that voices shouldn't come into your head at all. So when you have an angry, aggressive voice coming into your head, obviously it's going to be disturbing, obviously it's going to be anxiety provoking, and it may even provoke you to do things that you wouldn't do otherwise. In these other cultures, they have a different theory of mind. The mind is always open. The mind is always part of the community. Everything is shared. So it's a corporate, communal thing. The idea of being an individual person isn't really part of a number of cultures' ways of thinking about what it means to be a person. And so to have your own mind is an unusual concept because it's always open. You're open to the ancestors, you're open to all sorts of things. So when the research team asked American patients whether the voices were real, the question was easy for US subjects to answer. They recognized the distinction between real voices and voices inside your head, in part because the mind was understood as a closed space, as I'm saying. Having some other agent in your mind was clearly a sign of illness or dysfunction, so the voices were extremely disconcerting. So there's something about culture that makes voices highly problematic across different types of culture. And if you want to follow through in this way of thinking, there's an organization called the Hearing Voices Network, which is fascinating. It's across the world, actually. And what they're not in any sense anti-psychiatry. Nothing that I'm saying today is anti-psychiatry. I'm a great fan of psychiatry. It's just giving a different perspective, which I think is important for psychiatry and for everybody. So the Hearing Voices Network take the position that first of all, many people hear voices. It's not particularly unusual, so it's destigmatized in that sense. But secondly, the problem with voices is not necessarily simply the fact that you have voices, it's the impact upon these voices on your life. Some people live very well with voices. Some people are deeply tortured by voices. If you're deeply tortured by voices, then you need help. But if you want to live well with your voices, you don't necessarily need help in that way. So the Hearing Voices Network helps to rethink the suggestion that hearing voices is just a symptom, recognizing it as a part of people's experiences and working with it at that level. Now I'm going to give you an example of what that looks like and how that might be significant for the kinds of ways that we are thinking, the kind of relationships we have. But before I get into what we might call a case study, but it's not quite the right way to put it, there's a concept that I want you to have in mind. That's the concept of epistemic injustice. Episteme and epistemology being the theory of knowledge that you use to make sense of the world. Now, one of the things that is very clear is that if you have a condition like schizophrenia, people stop taking you seriously. Likewise, if you have a condition like dementia or any serious mental health challenge or brain disease, people stop taking you seriously. They belittle your opinions. Miranda Fricker, in this lovely book here called Epistemic Injustice, develops this idea of epistemic injustice. And so an example she would give would be if you had a business meeting and there were 5 men in the room and 1 woman, and the woman came up with a really great idea and nobody responded. And then 5 minutes later, a man comes up with the same idea and everybody thinks, oh, this is fantastic. So she's been treated unjustly because her knowledge has been rejected or not taken seriously. So that's what epistemic injustice means, not taking seriously the knowledge that the knower has. Now, in relation to mental health, that's very important because it's very easy just to discard the voices of people with mental health challenges. Epistemic injustice is rife in that sense. So this is how it runs. Jane has schizophrenia. Persons with schizophrenia are not credible reporters of their own experience, a stereotype. June, should be Jane, is not a credible reporter of her own experience, prejudice. I will listen, but I won't believe and or act on what she says, discrimination. So you can see stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination is central to that idea of epistemic injustice. Derek has depression. Depression is caused by sin or perhaps the demonic, a spiritual stereotype. Derek is not a credible reporter of his experience due to sin or demon possession, prejudice. I will listen, but I will pray for his release, spiritual abuse. So you can see how it runs. You have a diagnosis, you try to speak into a situation, people discredit you. So I needed to keep that framework or that theory in mind as we move into Alice's experience. So for the past few years, I've been working on a project looking at developing a phenomenological perspective on Christians in particular who live with serious mental health challenges. So people living with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depression. And using that phenomenological perspective I talked to you about earlier on, putting to one side my own assumptions about what the diagnosis should be and really listening to people's experience. And so I want to give you a taste of the kind of things that I discovered in that by looking at Alice's story. So Alice, obviously that's not her name. Alice was a young woman who had lived with schizophrenia since she was in her early teens, and she had horrible experiences. She had voices that told her to do terrible things. She had delusions. She was quite a tortured person. So, for example, the voice would tell her to go into the supermarket and just stand still. And she said, I had to do it, and I had to stand there for hours. And she said it was really embarrassing. And so she had a really torrid and difficult time in that sense. But then when she got into her early 20s, all of this phenomenon stopped. Now, there's 2 ways in which you can interpret that. For Alice, she told me that there was a group of women in her church who had been praying for her, not praying for her release from schizophrenia, but praying for her just to find a peace of mind. And she found healing in this. So for her, it was a supernatural event that stopped. Her psychiatrist felt that she'd probably been misdiagnosed. Somewhere in between there lies the truth. Either way, she no longer had this condition. Now, you might think that's a wonderful thing. And at one level, it is a wonderful thing. But as we'll see, her situation is more complicated. So I want to take you through some of the things that Alice has been through and some of the story that she gave to me. So begin at the first descriptions of her voices run like this. I'm sorry about this, that slide's a bit odd. They may all be. She says, my earliest recollection of it would have been at age 12, when I was sitting out in the back garden and I heard a voice that was outside of myself talking to me. And it wasn't very nice. In fact, it freaked me out. Growing up in the church that I had, my initial response was, well, this is obviously just demonic. I just need to pray more. I assumed that it was wrong, and that obviously it showed that I was going through some spiritual stuff. We won't tell mum and dad then, she says. And, it was that whole kind of guilt associated with it that this is only spiritual. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to say anything. So she comes from a tradition where that kind of phenomenon was assumed to be demonic in some ways. And she's taken that on, and now she ascribed that stigma, that spiritual stigma, to herself. The voices became more annoying than anything else because they wouldn't shut up. Something I just really wanted, sometimes I just really wanted to sleep, and they just didn't. There was just this constant barrage of people talking and information and babies crying. I had this baby that would cry in the background. Psychotherapists would love to look at that one, she said. You know, my inner child is screaming for relief, and all those kinds of things. And then we get this epistemic injustice. This is interesting. My life seemed like the surface of the sea in the storm, but God was the undercurrent that was peaceful. And so I did have some kind of recognition of what it was that I was feeling. But I mean, even then, because everyone was telling me you're nuts, you learned not to not trust everything you feel. So even the peaceful, the happy, or the joy, well, that could be manic, that could be psychosis, that could be, it's not real. And you can see how she's applying epistemic injustice to herself in this situation, realizing that nobody's going to listen to her because she has this particular diagnosis. She begins to doubt the important spiritual experiences that she has, and she becomes unjust towards herself because people are becoming unjust towards her, and she knows they will be. People assume that nothing you're feeling is real. When that happens, even the things that you want to be real, you write off as, no, they can't be. But when you're looking back, you go, no, that was actually, that was God. I wasn't crazy. And then she laughs. But nobody believes me. I mean, if you went into a church and said, oh, well, look, God's speaking to me about such and such, people would go, oh, John, the big theologian and professor. Then she laughs. Tell us more. But if I went into the church, and even if I wasn't going through my more difficult periods and said, oh, God's speaking to me, they'd be like, oh, dear, here she goes. And what has God been saying to you, dearie? So yes, it's not hard to write off people pretty quickly when it comes to God and everything else. I think it's really, really important, taking people seriously. But then she gets into something that's kind of distant and interesting. Our voice is inevitably bad. Now, we've already seen that tension between Africa, India, and America. See what she says. Yeah, I think that one of the things I found difficult was that they, the psychiatrists, would be like, your voices are bad, so we're going to give you medication to get rid of your voices. But I would say, yes, sometimes the voices are terrible, but all the voices are bad. Can we keep the nice ones? And so I understand why a lot of people don't take their medication, because it's actually sometimes a lot harder to be without your friends and to be with your enemies. It's better to have them all than to have none. What they don't take into account is that this is somebody's narrative, and these are characters in the narrative. And you can't just, it's like taking away from your family, you know. It's like you can't do that and not have any repercussions of that. You can't. And one of the fascinating things for Alice was one of her first experiences after the voices had stopped and moved on, and I said, if that's the right way of putting it, was she was lonely. So for so long, she had been surrounded by this cacophony of voices, and now there was nothing. And she had, you know, even though it was horrible, to have something is better than to have nothing. And so moving on, she then goes on to say something really interesting. One of the big things I found really hard when I first was healed was that I was really lonely. It was suddenly really quiet, and I didn't have anyone to talk to in the middle of the night. And so that was really bad. I went through the whole grieving process for things, for people that weren't real, which was really difficult, because who do you go to for that? Hey, I'm really grieving over a friend that never really existed. She laughs, it's kind of hard. And she talked about one of her voices that was supportive to her. When all these other voices were horrible, this voice would be supportive to her. And she had a name for it, and she had a relationship with it. Now, when they were taken away, she had then had to explain to people, or not to explain to people, but she had to come to terms with the fact that she was grieving for somebody that never existed. And she was aware that that's the case, but she knew that she couldn't tell other people, because if she says to other people, I'm grieving because for somebody that never existed, they'll think, oh, she's getting psychotic again. So she had to work through her grief, and it was a genuine grief on her own. And it's interesting because sometimes when you speak to people who live with psychosis, they'll tell you something very similar about the way that medication sometimes functions in that way. It pushes down the voices and it controls the symptoms, and it does give a great deal of relief, but sometimes it's accompanied by loneliness, because sometimes people do relate to their voices in ways that are positive, as well as obviously ways that are negative. I met people when I was in hospital, and a lot of them in their sane moments, and you can always tell when someone is having a lucid moment, would talk about how lonely they were and how much their medication made them feel so isolated and lonely. And it's like, if you're used to years of being surrounded, to take away the community is crazy. It's crazy. It doesn't actually address what that community was there for in the first place. Now, the point here is not that medication is bad. I absolutely wouldn't say that. The point is that when we give medication, we've got to realize that there are actually relational and emotional side effects, if you like, that we can very easily miss if we're not concentrating on the lived experience of the person, as well as the material, as well as the symptoms that we're trying to treat. So this is just a little bit here of the person I mentioned earlier on, the voice that befriended her. She says, Anne was an actual person to me, even though she wasn't a person. And I knew she wasn't real. I knew not to talk to her in public, but she was someone I could confide in and talk to. She was a person who was always there when I was upset. She was probably the biggest loss to me. She wasn't there after that. I had to do it alone. I had to figure out how to do life alone. I mean, she wasn't always the best influence, but she was there. And that's really hard to explain. And it must be really hard to explain. So, coming to the conclusion of what I want to say. In Romans 12:2, the Apostle Paul talks about the idea of renewing your mind. And what he means there is to allow the things that you know about your tradition to change the way that you see the world. To take the stories and narratives that are given to you and look out in the world. Nothing much changes out there, but you see it differently because your mind is renewed. And I think it's the same kind of thing that we need to think about in relation to mental health. To take seriously the stories that we know, the stories that come to us from medicine and psychiatry, but also to take seriously the stories that come from people's experience, and to allow our minds to be renewed and to see things differently. And when we see things differently, we can act more compassionately. I mean, one of the things that we've noticed even in this short period of time we've been talking about is, at one level, people have pathological conditions that cause psychosis, but sometimes our cultures are pathogenic. Sometimes the way that we talk about people, the way that the language that we use, the way that we stigmatize and alienate people makes an already difficult situation even worse. And Tanya Luhrmann's research is interesting, isn't it? Because it says some cultures can be, the way that we frame things can be pathogenic, can cause pathology. Other cultures can be more open to healing and more open to compassion. And that's why the issue of language is very important, because the way that we talk about things articulates what we think we see. And what we think we see determines how we respond to what we think we see. So the language is important. So using the language, for example, of hearing voices is important because it takes seriously the lived experience of people. Hallucinations is important because if you're doing research, if you're a psychiatrist looking at things in particular ways, that's important. But for those of us who are not clinicians, those of us who just simply want to be alongside the people, hearing voices draws attention to the importance of just living with people and listening to what they're saying directly. Spiritual stigma, the question of the demonic, I'll give that a miss for the moment. Only to say that sometimes the way in which we use our faith tradition can be highly problematic for people living with mental health challenges. And you can see that with Alice, when at the beginning point of her experience of hearing voices, she herself automatically ascribed that to the demonic, because she knew that within her community, that would be the demonic, that would be perceived as demonic. But what I would say to you, if any of you have any interest or questions about that, think about the way in which the New Testament talks about the demonic. A couple of things. First of all, most of the demon possessions that you see in the New Testament are actually physical. And we very rarely, when somebody has a sore back or some kind of physical ailment, very rare for us to say, well, it must be the demonic. So why do we do it when it comes to people's minds in that sense? And secondly, if you take the way in which we work out, professionals work out diagnosis, which is a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorder. If you take the criterion that's laid down there, for example, for schizophrenia, and place it against anybody in the Gospels, you'll see it's a different thing. It's a different thing going on. So you have to ask yourself, why is it that we go in that direction when the Scripture seems to tell us not to go in that direction? And one of the reasons is that we tend to take our understandings of the demonic more from Hollywood than from Jerusalem. And when we do that, then people begin to suffer. So beware of that. Okay, 2 more points before I finish. First one is the issue of generosity. One of the things that, particularly for a highly stigmatized condition like schizophrenia, one of the things that we discover very quickly is that people are not generous towards people who live with severe mental health challenges. People are reluctant to give them the gift of friendship, reluctant to give them the gift of value, they tend to stigmatize and caricature. So I think one of the things that we should really all be thinking about if we're taking issues around mental health seriously is to be generous with our relationships, to be generous with our love and compassionate, and to be generous in the way that we are with one another, to ensure that no matter what somebody's going through, that they're not excluded from your community, from your life. And the second thing is epistemic generosity. Instead of assuming that everything that somebody's saying is a lot of rubbish and everything that somebody says is to do with the pathology, try listening. Because people always have something to say in the midst of the confusion. And we've seen that with Alice, that odd and unusual as her perspective is, she's got something to say and something for us to learn from. So I suggest that what we need to think about is developing holy alliances, working with mental health professionals, working with religious communities, working with groups, in order that we can hold together both the biological, medical dimensions of mental health and these other lived experiences that are so important for quality of life and for understanding and coming to a place of relationship with people. And that all works itself out as a profoundly important aspect of spiritual care. And so really, that's all I want to talk to you about just now. I think I've given you enough information. But the one thing I want you just to think about is people are people. The fact that you have a mental health challenge means that, yeah, you have to maybe see the world differently. Yeah, certain things you need to understand and need to be adjusted. All of us need help. But the bottom line is people are people. And we're all in this place together. And when we get to that space, we can see that even if we're dealing with something as difficult as schizophrenia can be, if we can see someone as a person to begin with, before we do anything else or think anything else, then that changes our response. And if we change our response, then the possibility of friendship, hospitality, generosity, and community becomes a reality. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swinton. This really gave us a lot, I think, to be thinking about. I want to just say a word of thanks to the Alumni Relations Office for hosting this virtual event and the wonderful job they are doing. I'm going to allow myself a question while those people in the audience can submit their questions, as you see, how to submit a question. The organization of this lecture is tied to the Social Innovation Weekend, which is coming up very soon, on the theme of mental health and resilience. So you touched on this, I think, already at the end of your talk, but I was wondering if you could say a few more words about how studying these kind of extreme, what we tend to think of as extreme cases of people who hear voices, brings us lessons of how we address any kind of mental health challenges, be it depression or anything else. So for people who are going to participate in this, whether students or staff, faculty, thinking about how this might give them a different perspective on mental health issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. I mean, I think. I'm a theologian, so therefore I think as a theologian thinks. But it seems to me that there are, within our understanding of mental health, there's two models of health that very often run together. One is the biomedical model of health, which looks after the problems that you experience, which may have to adjust certain things in relation to medication or in relation to forms of treatment and therapy and counselling. So there's that professional dimension there that is extremely important. But there's a second model of health, and that's not determined by the presence or absence of your symptoms. You see, one of the challenges for people is that if you have something like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or major depression, you may well have to live with that for the rest of your life. Now, if you have a model of health which is determined by getting rid of symptoms or getting rid of this particular condition, then you're going to be ill for always, and that's not a pleasant place to be, just to think that I'm always going to be ill. Whereas if you think about health as the ability to achieve the kind of things that you want to achieve within the parameters of what you are able to do, to be able to be the best person you can within the context of your particular set of experiences, then that means that you can actually find health even in the midst of illness. So there's a biblical concept called shalom that I think is a helpful one. Shalom it's like a greeting. We often use it as a greeting. So its basic meaning is peace, but it's a big peace with the world, peace with the environment, peace with one another. But sitting at the heart of that is the idea that true health is to be in right relationship with God, with others, and with the creation, with the environment. And that's not determined by your physical or psychological health. It's determined by your spirituality, broadly defined, your sense of who you are. Where do I come from? Where am I going to? Why? These are the big questions that all religions try to answer. But when you're hit by a big diagnosis, like these questions, who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going to? And why? Become fundamentally important. And if you can be enabled to answer these questions constructively, then you can find health even in the midst of illness. And so there's these two worlds of health, both of which are really important, but one has a louder voice than the other. And I'm kind of advocating for the voice that helps us to remember that being healthy doesn't simply mean getting rid of your symptoms. There's other things there that are equally as important. And that applies across the board, I think.
Thank you. So we have one question from Diane Wright, who thanks you for the lecture. And she says, I'm a social worker who has worked for many years in a large community behavioral health center. And she's interested in the undercurrents of shame that seem to be connected with the accounts from America, by contrast with that from India and Africa that you were talking about. So if you could say more about this, the kind of the shame that goes on specifically in American culture.
Yeah, there's a problem. Western culture in general has a problem when it comes to anything to do with your brain. Stephen Post, a very interesting ethicist, talks about Western culture as being hypercognitive, which means we place more value on issues around intellect and reason than we do on friendship, community, love, and other important quality of life issues. Now he points out that if you get something, when he's talking in this context, if you get something like dementia, which seems to really strike at the heart of your intellect and reason, then you really are put in a position where your being is countercultural, where everything that's expected that society desires is the opposite of the way that you are. And it's the same thing when it comes to certain forms of mental health challenge. That the fact that, if you have schizophrenia, we'll stick with that as I've been talking about that. The fact that you get confused, the fact that you see the world differently, the fact that your intellect and reason are not functioning that way, means that you are functioning counterculturally. And so therefore people look at you in quite a particular way. And you look at yourself in quite a particular way because you're part of that culture. So it's that idea of cultural expectations being turned on their head by you and that experience, and that leads to shame and alienation, and also importantly, it leads to stigmatization. And I mean, that stigma is so interesting. I mean, stigma is, Evan Goffman, who wrote a really interesting book on stigma many years ago, he points out that stigma, the idea of stigma comes from the Greek slave trade, where a slave owner would put a mark onto a human being, and that human being would no longer be a human being. They would simply be a mark. So they no longer have a name, a family, or anything else, just a mark. And sometimes psychiatric diagnosis can function in that way. And I think that's where the shame element comes in, because you've got a stigmatized condition that's countercultural. That's everything that culture wants, you suddenly find that you're doing the opposite of. And B, you have a label that people are afraid of, and that actually covers you as a person. So you can no longer peek out from behind it. It becomes the whole of who you are. So if I have influenza, I don't become the flu. But if I have schizophrenia, people talk about me as a schizophrenic, as if it's something that I am, like a Martian or a Londoner or a New Yorker or whatever it would be. So that's it, and that's the non-clinical dimension that all of us should be trying to counter.
There were two questions about the theory of mind by Julian Jaynes, whether you're familiar with this and how perhaps your own understanding is similar or different. So I don't know if that's something you want to take up.
No, it's not. I haven't read that book for quite some time. It's a controversial theory, and it's one that certain more radical psychiatrists have certainly picked up on. It's not something I've spent any time with, any great amount of time with, so I wouldn't really want to comment on it, other than it's an interesting theory that's worth following through, and there is some resonance with what he says with what I've been saying, but I wouldn't recommend it as the next step.
There's another question about addiction, and is it, if you have any thoughts on maybe people feeling like they're driven to act in ways that are addictive because of, a sort of voice that tells them to encourage them to certain kinds of behaviors and things like this.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a problem. The voice hearing is different from the experience that people have when they're addicted. I mean, there is a drivenness within addiction, and there is a kind of inability to escape from the particular substance that you're engaged with or you're addicted to. I don't think it's necessarily a voice, but it's definitely a strong emotion that would be similar. I mean, the similarity would be if you have very powerful voices telling you to do something, and you feel compelled to do that, which certainly can be the case. And so there would be an analogy there between that and having a very powerful desire to have a drug. But I think that the two things are different, and the two things are best kept separate, I think.
There's a question from Charles. What role might technology play in this? Is it true that more advanced society is, the more this phenomena is chalked up to mental health issues. You know, if there's an impact on all the technology we're engaged in all the time.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think technology is particularly good for our mental health. But I don't know whether there would be a correlation between voice hearing and technology. But what I think there might be is a connection between technology and a lowering of compassion. Now, one of the things, if I had a lot of money, one study I would do would be to go into just a kind of survey or a neurological exploration of people who use something like Facebook, for example, or whatever your social media preference is. Like, because the way that you communicate on Facebook or is very different from the way you communicate in real life. And for us to when we're communicating, we're responding to one another. And we're responding to one another because there's mirror neurons at the front of our brains that mirror the emotions of the person that we're looking at. So when you smile, I smile. When I cry, you cry, and so on and so forth. But if you spend your whole day on a telephone, and if you're constantly breaking up of relationships and constantly building them for no particular reason, over time, I suspect that your mirror neurons would become less, because the brain is, if you don't use it, you lose it. And so I have a suspicion that over time, we may become less compassionate people because we're less able to use we're less engaged with reality, and we're less able to use our mirror neurons, which are central to being able to act compassionately in that way. Now, I'm not a neurologist, so if there's any neurologists, they're probably all laughing at me just now. But I think there's something in it that technology is difficult neurologically.
Right. Let's see. There was a question. So actually, several questions here from, I think, a student. What sort of correlations do you see to your studies outside of Christian populations, and how do they compare? I think you touched on that already in your talk. Have your studies had any focus on adverse childhood experiences or trauma in general? And what have you noticed in particular about marginalized communities experiencing mental health challenges?
Yeah, well, on the issue of childhood experiences, and not in my research, because the kind of research I'm just now isn't therapeutic in that sense. So I'm not pushing into that. It's a slightly different perspective. But there is a good deal of literature, if you're interested, that looks at certain correlations between voice hearing and childhood experiences, including trauma. So there is a body of literature there that would indicate that for some voice hearing, there's a connection there. So it's something you could easily go and research and have a look at. I haven't, but that's because I'm doing something slightly different. And what was the last point, Scott?
About marginalized communities and how maybe the experience of mental health challenges in marginalized communities.
It depends. It depends on which marginalized community we're talking about. Like, I spent quite a lot of time in communities like the L'Arche community, which focuses primarily on people with intellectual disabilities, and Camp Hill communities is the same way. And certainly within these communities, the response to mental health issues is quite different. So the response to mental health is to keep the person in community, to continue to work with them, and if they actually have to leave the community, to accompany them in that way. So these communities focus on marginalized people and focus on creating communities where marginalized people can actually find a safe space to be sometimes unwell in that way. So the communities which look at, because they don't exactly look after marginalized people, that contain and focus on marginalized people, and part of their work there is to destigmatize mental health in that way. So they become marginalized communities because they look after marginalized people, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
All right, and I have a question, which I think is something also you've touched on in your talk a bit, but from Joseph Corbett, one of my students. Do you feel like there's a throwaway culture regarding not just those with mental health concerns, with things like dementia, but even the elderly kind of in general?
I think there is. I mean, one of my other main areas is the area of dementia and dementia care and aging. And because of the type of culture that we live in, we value youth and competitiveness and power more than we might want to. I mean, it's kind of like it's a capitalist system, and we kind of oftentimes mirror capitalism in our relationships. And so people, when it comes to elderly people, they very quickly become stigmatized because they're no longer able to be competitive, to be powerful, to be able to do the things. When it comes to dementia, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier on, as soon as you start to lose your reason and rationality, sort of which appear, you become alienated. You become a group of people that are no longer a part of community. So yeah, I think that we do alienate particular groups of people, and the elderly and people with dementia are prime examples of our fear of aging, which I think ties in with our general fear of death within society. That we don't have a lot of stories that can explain death, so we're constantly pushing against death. So we become, if you like, a death-denying culture, and part of that death-denying culture means that anything that reminds us of death, we're afraid of and we push away. And of course, aging, disability, mental health, dementia remind us of A, our own future, and B, our own mortality. And so we tend to push away and try to avoid them. So there's a cultural dynamic there that I think is very important and very destructive for certain groups of people.
I would just note that my own father was suffering from dementia before he passed away, and I read your book, which is what led to the introduction for you to give this lecture, because it was really a deeply moving and powerful book. So I highly recommend that for everyone in the audience. I think we have a last sort of more of a comment than a question, but Lance Frank says, as a retired pastor and state social worker drug counselor, I noted that most of my clients who heard religious related voices tend to express syncretistic, often mutually conflicted, and usually negative or condemnatory voices. Rarely in an American context were they helpful or comforting. Rarely were they congruent with the historic religious motifs and traditions. Seems to affirm much of the point of your lecture. I found that accepting and getting into those person's world was helpful to them, not necessarily curative, but supportive. I suppose it is hospitality in action. This is not much of a question, but an observation that seems to affirm your view.
It's a great observation. And I think that the last point on the centrality of hospitality is extremely important. Like, just simply by allowing yourself to enter into somebody's world, with it non-judgmentally, and just listening to work out what's going on with them, it's just such a big gift to people. It's complicated. It's not straightforward, but it is a gift. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was really a very delightful and inspiring evening, I'm sure, for everyone. So I'm sure everyone appreciates it. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. It's been nice.